Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. Now, Russia's widening restrictions on Armenian exports have transformed a trade dispute into a broader geopolitical test in the South Caucasus. While Moscow cites technical concerns, many see the measure as pressure on a government that has steadily deepened ties with Europe. The European Union is now preparing financial support and trade concessions for Armenia. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss the implications is Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Studies Center, a leading analyst of regional politics and security. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you.
Taking a look at Russia's recent move towards Armenia, they are saying that a lot of the import restrictions are actually just technical trade measures. Now, do we buy that?
Well, the short answer is no. The longer answer is Armenia just weathered its latest parliamentary election just weeks ago. The re-election of the incumbent government in a free and fair election. That was the trigger and the timing for Russia's imposition of trade restrictions on Armenian exports to Russia. Very much it was an exercise by Russia flexing its muscles to increase pressure on the Armenian government.
Right, and how effective do you think that is going to be? And do you think that the muscle flexing is only targeted towards Armenia or any other countries that perhaps might also be starting to lean to the West?
Good question, Benjamin. Russia has a long record of using energy and economics as weapons against states or neighbors that drift too far westward. Armenia simply is the latest target after similar incidents involving Moldovan exports to Russia. But for Armenia, it was counterproductive for two reasons. First, the Russian pressure only helped the incumbent Armenian government in pursuit of deepening relations with the EU as an alternative. Secondly, it was also counterproductive in strictly economic terms because it was the EU that moved unusually quickly to help Armenia in this economic crisis.
Right, and speaking of alleviation, do you think the EU measures right now will be able to alleviate some of the stress, the economic stress that Russia is trying to press upon Armenia?
Well, to be honest, no. As welcome as the EU move is, as unusually quick and rapid the response, it is simply an uphill battle. Russia remains the primary import and export partner for Armenia, and Armenia's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union is a severe limitation on any real economic diversification. The good news, however, is the EU has doubled its role as a trading partner with Armenia. For example, Armenian exports to EU have more than doubled and increased, while Armenian exports to Russia, even before the imposition of the trade restrictions, have been declining. So there is some positive news, and that statistical reality doesn't lie and shows Russia's weakness.
All right, but do you think that this still gives Russia enough leverage to sway the politics in Armenia one way or another? We know traditionally economics are very closely tied to electoral results.
Well, very good point you raised. In terms of Russian leverage over Armenia is no longer security or frozen conflicts. It's much more about economic and trade leverage. Nevertheless, it's not going to work simply because the Armenian government, especially after its fresh mandate to continue its policies of deepening relations with the West and with the EU, is committed to countering that Russian leverage. So yes, it's a significant limitation short term, but long term, this is really about a more democratic Armenia resisting the Russian orbit.
All right, speaking of long term, let's play this out a little bit. Like you mentioned, it's really hard for EU to be a replacement for Russia, which still has a significant amount of import. And if we stretch this out, do you see any way where any other trading partner can become a realistic replacement for the reliance on the Russian economy? Or do you think that they have to eventually go back to some sort of trade?
Well, I'm optimistic for two specific reasons. First of all, the one sector of the Armenian economy growing the fastest, at over 20% annually, is the Armenian IT sector, which has no Russian presence, and more importantly, is bolstered by a recent US-Armenian deal over data centers, NVIDIA chip production, AI development. So the future is especially promising in the right sector, technology and IT, which is real entrepreneurship and innovation. The second reason I'm optimistic is in many ways, Armenia's exports are being redirected to much more attractive markets in the West, including the expected reopening of the border between Armenia and Turkey. That's the real game changer. Whereas Russia is rather remote and Armenia has no land border with Russia, which is an obstacle for Russia maintaining its dominance. But finally, it's Armenia's position in the Eurasian Economic Union that precludes EU membership. And that's going to be the real test.
Right. You brought something interesting here that I want to touch a little bit upon about the U.S.-Armenia deal, because it does seem like even the Washington administration now is paying a little bit more attention to Armenia as opposed to previously. Do you think that the U.S. will have any sort of role to play here?
It already does. We had, for example, the February visit of the U.S. Vice President, and then the more recent fly-in visit of Secretary of State Rubio to sign not just agreements on transit and transport, but actually demonstrating further progress on U.S.-Armenian IT and also rare earth development in terms of critical minerals. So I do think the EU role in economic diversification is key, is crucial. It's also about the U.S. deepening its engagement in Armenia.
And now if Armenia does want to detach itself from economic reliance on Russia, what are some of the most glaring practical obstacles that you foresee ahead, given its geography and its transport restrictions? Do you think that they'll be able to overcome some of those hurdles?
Well, the key word you used in the question is practical. And to be both practical and prudent, the Armenian government is not looking to replace Russia with any other alternative. Rather, it's to balance or correct the overdependence on the Russian market. So I do think it's realistic. It's also interesting that beyond Russia and the EU as the traders, China is a very close third trading partner for Armenia, in third place. So I do think diversification is not just looking to the West, it's also looking to China.
Now, going back to what you mentioned earlier, Armenia still remains a member of the Eurasian Economic Union as well, while simultaneously also moving closer to Europe. Is this balancing act somehow sustainable?
No, it's an inherent contradiction. However, short to medium term, Armenia is expected to actually leverage its position in the Eurasian Economic Union. For example, the attractiveness of Armenia as an export platform for Turkish goods going through Armenia into the Eurasian Economic Union, or a future Iranian economic opportunity or opening. So there is some benefit, but the real prudence in Armenia, although it's a leading democracy, it's looking to balance against overdependence on Russia. Armenia now has more value to Russia and Moscow much less value to Armenia. So the outlook is promising.
From the Russian end, if they decide somehow that these trade measures are not enough, are there still space for them to apply even more measures? Are there any additional tools that it have at its disposal?
Well, yes. The the real picture here of Armenia's vulnerability is not necessarily just this export restriction regime. Rather, it's Russia sending subsidized natural gas to Armenia. Armenia remains dangerously dependent on the inflows, the imports of Russian gas. When and if Russia does renegotiate the price of that gas, that's the real leverage. That's a sign of Russia escalating the conflict or tension. But it's unlikely to happen, in my opinion. In fact, to be honest, the recently re-elected Armenian government and its Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, is expected on his first foreign trip to go to Moscow and to reassure the Russians. So Armenia is looking much more to not or to avoid unnecessarily provoking a Russian overreaction. So the short answer is this tension, the trade friction, is now expected to be much less and for Russia to climb down.
Right. Last but not least, even though there are a lot of hurdles as we have been discussing, do you think the recent parliamentary election is a sign that the Armenian people or Armenia is ready and more confident in pursuing foreign policy independent of Moscow, or at least slightly more detached from it?
No, I would be much more vehement in arguing that the election revealed not just the deepening of democracy in Armenia, but providing a reaffirmation, a mandate of the policies of the Armenian government, which is much more moving westward, much more about bolstering Armenian independence, and much less about seeking any return to the Russian orbit. But moreover, Armenia is now endowed with a rare commodity of legitimacy and stability, much more than all of its neighbors.
Right. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Appreciate it. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.